Welcome to Nostalgia Basketball, Part 1, Episode 3, the Western Conference of the 2016-2017 NBA regular season. Although Golden State dominated this season through and through, the West was a lot more competitive than the East, and the teams in the West as a whole were a lot better. The retirements of NBA legends Kevin Garnett, Kobe Bryant, and Tim Duncan all affected teams in the West, so that's also something for us to look into. There's a lot of fun storylines to look back on, so this is Son of a Sports, and let's get into it. Phoenix had, I think, the second worst record in all of the basketball. They had the worst record in the West, and there's only one thing to take away from this season. Devin Booker dropped 70 points in a game against Boston, who ended up being the first seed in the East. And although they were getting blown out, although Phoenix was getting blown out, Devin Booker went on to drop 70 points. I think he's the youngest player in NBA history to do so. He was in his second year in the league, and in college he was coming off the bench. So no one saw him forming into this star like this, and he did it. Like, he really did it. It was insane. Phoenix did not have a good roster that year. Devin Booker and Eric Bledsoe were the only two players that played well or scored a lot for him. I wouldn't say they played that well because both of them shot very, very bad in terms of field goal percentage, effective field goal percentage. They shot okay from the three. I mean, Devin shot okay from the three. Eric was a decent playmaker, and Eric went on to go to the Bucks, and everything played out there. TJ Warren was a part of the Suns team. Brandon Knight, Marquise Chris, Tyson Chandler was still really good. But outside of that, PJ Tucker was lost on the bench, and they eventually traded him to Toronto, where he turned his career around. Derrick Jones Jr. was like a 19-year-old rookie on this team. And then Dragon Bender, their other rookie, was absolutely, I don't even want to say the word with him. He was just bad. The Kobe Bryant-less Lakers were the second worst team in the West, and for good reason. Their signings of Luol Deng and Timofey Mozgov proved to be horrific signings. Lou Williams was a good piece, but he didn't really match up with their timeline. D'Angelo Russell was their second leading scorer. However, there were chemistry issues with him and the rest of the team due to an obvious incident that happened the previous year. Jordan Clarkson and Julius Randle were good young pieces, just not really set up to be the superstars they needed. And Brandon Ingram struggled significantly as a rookie, and Lakers fans were already worried about their second overall pick. So, owner Jeannie Buss shook up Lakers management significantly, hiring Magic Johnson and Rob Pelinka to be the head of basketball operations and the general manager. That she fired her brother in doing this, and Mitch Kupchak, who is what led to Charlotte being a disaster recently. Their first act as general manager and head of basketball operations was to trade Lou Williams and try to tank out the rest of the season, leading them to getting the second overall pick. And the Lakers were also lining themselves up for free agency for the next offseason in 2018. Although this Timberwolves team was the third worst team in the West, they were my second favorite team to watch this year. Cat was in his second year in the league, averaging 25 points per game. Andrew Wiggins was averaging 24 points per game in his third year in the league. And Zach LaVine was averaging 19 points per game and developing into a really good scorer until that ACL injury caught him. That really hurt. But they were so much fun to watch. I'm not going to lie. They were all 21 years old. And then Gorgie Dang, Shabazz Muhammad, Neman Bjelica, they were a lot of fun right next to them. Chris Dunn and Tyus Jones, a lot of people were concerned about how they would fit in the NBA, and Tyus Jones actually ended up being really good. Chris Dunn is still finding his way on NBA teams and working out. And the other thing, too, was Ricky Rubio this was the best fit for him until he got around Phoenix. That was a fun time for Ricky, but Ricky on this team, they needed a playmaker, and he offered that perfectly. I know this team was the third worst in the West, and they ended up going in a different direction the next year, but I really, really like this iteration of the Timberwolves. This Kings team was very interesting because they didn't have a good roster by any means. Darren Collison was good still. Rudy Gay was good, but he only played 30 games. Tyreek Evans played 14 games and averaged around 11 points. 36-year-old Matt Barnes was cut halfway through the year. Willie Cauley-Stein did okay with his expanded role towards the end of the year. This roster was just not very good. Garrett Temple was okay, but it just really did not have much. I think towards the end of the year, their only guy that could really give him a lot of points per game was the rookie they traded for halfway through the year. DeMarcus Cousins at the beginning of the year, averaging around 28 points per game on pretty bad efficiency, but he was still a really good center, and this was probably the peak of his powers with the Kings. The thing with the Kings that was so interesting is that halfway through the year, they traded their best player, and they were neck and neck and seeding right next to the... Oh, there was a team in between that? It's my favorite team? My bad. Okay, with the Mavericks, this team was not very good. This team was expecting to at least make some sort of playoff push, hoping Deron Williams would have something left in him, hoping Dirk would have something left in him, hoping Andrew Bogut could still pull off something, but Bogut was not very good with this team. He played 26 games and averaged 3 points a game, and they eventually cut him, and he went to Cleveland. I've already talked about that in the Eastern Conference video. This team really had nothing. Like Dirk, this was the point of no return for Dirk. He averaged 14 points a game on 43% from the field, and just it wasn't looking that well for him anymore. Harrison Barnes was fine. He was a young piece that they got in that Golden State trade. Wesley Matthews, Deron Williams, they were old, and Deron got cut halfway through the year and went to the Cavs as well. Like, there was nothing to take away from this team other than this was the peak of in between Dirk's era and going into the Luka era. Okay, back to DeMarcus Cousins and the Pelicans and the Kings and all that. So he was traded during the All-Star break to New Orleans for Buddy Hield and a 2017 first rounder. And I think Tyreek Evans was included in that trade, and he was sent to New Orleans with DeMarcus. They were actually in New Orleans for the All-Star break. It was crazy. And if you remember this, he got whispered in his ear during the press conference that he got traded and said, "Oh, I love being in New Orleans." But this New Orleans team they were so far behind at this point in the year that I don't know how much Boogie and AD could have pulled off in those last 17 games for them to be able to go make the playoffs, because as well as they played together, it just wasn't going to happen. That team was not ready for a playoff push, and that team was so far behind in that stacked West that it just wasn't going to happen. Solomon Hill was fine. I mean, he wasn't really giving you much. Terrence Jones, Jordan Crawford, they were good pieces that were giving you a little bit in the games they played. Buddy Hield, the time he played in New Orleans before he was traded to Sacramento, he was not very good, and he shot really poorly from three and from the field. And Tyreek Evans in his few games there, he shot fine and played fine. But it was really about going into 2018 and trying to get Drew, DeMarcus, and AD all together and healthy with good chemistry. The final team that didn't make the playoffs was the Denver Nuggets, and they were really good. They were almost there, and they went all in on Jokic by trading Yusuf Nurkic for Mason Plumlee, a guy they didn't have to give much minutes to, compared to Nurkic, who was still really good and good for this team and way better for Portland. We'll get into that in a minute. They went all in on trying to establish, okay, Jokic is our guy going forward. This guy that averaged 17 points per game with 10 rebounds and 5 assists in his second season in the league. He was way smarter than people thought. And they were playing him in weird power forward lineups with Nurkic or having to not even start him at the beginning of the year. It sucked because you really wanted to see what Jokic could really do. And once Nurkic was gone, you saw the potential. Not the potential of an MVP, but the potential there. You also wanted to see things like what Jamal Murray could do in his rookie year, and if Emmanuel Mudiay could really pick up the pace. He really struggled early in the league, and he's not in the league anymore, but he really struggled in terms of being an efficient scorer. Will Barton as well, and Gary Harris. You wanted to see what the Jokic era was going to look like and what guys you wanted to keep going forward. And Danilo Gallinari, he was probably their best player that year. Maybe Jokic, you could argue. But Gallinari obviously didn't match with the timeline, and we'll get into that in another day. Okay, moving on to the playoff teams, Portland. Portland started out the year horrible. Like at one point in March, they were around 24-35. They were the 11th seed in the West. They were flat out awful at one point. But then they made a trade midseason, and they acquired Yusuf Nurkic, and that changed everything for him. Everything. Yusuf Nurkic for Mason Plumlee. Plumlee, as you all know, he's not a starting caliber center in the league, and he hasn't been. And that really was what screwed them. They need offensive rebounding help. They needed rebounding help in general. And Nurkic came in, and in his last 20 games with the Trailblazers that year, his 20 games with the Trailblazers that year, they went 14-6. That was incredible for him. And they went on a nice run to make it 41-41 on the season to get in the playoffs in the first place. And even though they lost in the first round, I mean, they still really went on a good run to end the year. The 7th-seeded Grizzlies were Memphis' last chance in the grit and grind era. Gasol and Conley were still all-star caliber players, but Zach Randolph and Tony Allen were both 35 years old. Allen was still a good defender, and they were both decent to good scorers. However, the Grizzlies' style of play was getting aged out of the league. The league was advancing in terms of three-point shooting and faster offenses that required a lot more shooters. The Grizzlies didn't have that. Vince Carter, Troy Daniels, Marc Gasol, and Mike Conley were their only capable three-point shooters. Their style of play was being phased out of the league. And on top of that, their big signing of Chandler Parsons turned out to be a major disaster for the franchise. They went through a lot of obstacles to try to make the playoffs, but they still did it. When people look back on 2017, they remember one name, Russell Westbrook. This man dominated this season. He owned it. This was his season. He averaged a triple-double, and he was the second player in NBA history to do so, and the first player to do it in almost 50 years. Almost 50 years. Russell Westbrook was also the first player to do it in the modern era. It was something that was thought to be impossible at this point in the league. But his fast level of offense, his fast style of play, his ability to dominate on the fast break and find shooters or his center and Steven Adams or Ennis Freedom, he was unreal. He took a Oklahoma City team that had no business being in the playoffs to the 6th seed with guys like Victor Oladipo, Andre Roberson, Steven Adams, Enes Kanter, Taj Gibson, all around him. 3 of the guys I just named are centers, and one of them one of the guards I just named is a non-shooter in this league, and it was almost out of the league within 2 years because he couldn't shoot anymore. Ersan Ilyasova was a good center right next to him. A rookie, Domantas Sabonis. Doug McDermott, who didn't really get a lot of minutes, and I think was traded halfway through the year or traded to them. Jeremy Grant was decent, but really, really young. This team was not meant to be in the playoffs whatsoever. But Russell Westbrook, with a 31.6 points per game average, with 10.4 assists and 10.7 rebounds, did it. He freaking did it. This Jazz team was the first iteration of the Jazz making the playoffs in the Rudy Gobert era. Gordon Hayward and Gobert really fit well. I like this fit for a team in the modern NBA. George Hill, Rodney Hood, Joe Ingles, Gordon Hayward, and Rudy Gobert. You had a lot of floor spacers right next to Rudy Gobert, and Gordon Hayward was your main wing that was giving you a little bit of everything. Off the bench, Derek Favors, he didn't really fit the modern NBA anymore. That's why he fell out of the league in a few years after that. But Joe Johnson, Dante Exum, Trey Lyles, Boris Diaw, and Alec Burks are guys that fit the modern NBA really well, and I really liked how this team fit. This Clippers team was the last iteration of the Lob City era, and it all started out amazing with a 14-2 start near the end of November. But a backslide and losing streak following that start pushed them down all the way to the 4th seed at the beginning of January. And that's where they stayed for the rest of the year. It was clear that this team desperately needed a starting caliber small forward, something that was missed throughout all of the Lob City era. It was clear that this team was tired of trying and failing every year, and all the rumors of CP3 and Blake not getting along were only heating up. Both Jamal Crawford and Austin Rivers styles of play, where they were only offering inefficient scoring, just didn't cut it off the bench anymore, and Luke Baumute and Raymond Felton were underrated contributors. The only thing to take away from this season was DeAndre Jordan making All-NBA third team. Outside of that, this team it was their last run, and it was clear that it was going to be their last run. This run for the Rockets was a lot of fun. This was the year they finally put it all together and made it clear that they are not a team that's just going to fall off, because it looked like they were falling off the previous year. Mike D'Antoni being the coach and allowing James Harden to be the true point guard for this team was so much fun to watch, because having shooters like Trevor Ariza, Eric Gordon, Ryan Anderson, Patrick Beverly all around him was just fun. He kicking the ball out to them, seeing how much they could create and score with him. And he averaged near 30 points. If Russ is not the MVP, James Harden was. And James Harden arguably deserved MVP. This was a cool team that traded for Lou Williams and had 2 6-man of the year candidates on their team in Eric Gordon and Lou Williams. And they just fit really well. This was the 3rd seed team in the West. And they were the only team people thought outside of the Spurs could really take the Warriors on, just because of how well these pieces fit all together. The 2nd seeded 61-win Spurs team was insane. This was after Tim Duncan retired, and they had to go and move on. Kawhi Leonard developed into a superstar, offensively and defensively. Paul Gasol took Tim Duncan's spot at the 5 and showed he still has some game left to him, averaging 12 points in 25 minutes. Tony Parker and Manu Ginobili still gave a lot of game, even though they're both at the twilight of their career. Manu was almost 40 at this point and still giving you 8 minutes a game, or 8 points a game, with pretty good efficiency. Tony Parker was still a dog at 34 years old. LaMarcus Aldridge, even though he had issues with Kawhi being the man, they still fit really well together. And I really, really loved this iteration of the Spurs, because they played their brand of basketball, but with Kawhi really taking control as the top dog in San Antonio. And the Warriors. Who else? They went 67-15 after going 73-9 the previous year. They had Kevin Durant on their team. They kept all the pieces on their team that they really needed. They added Zaza Pachulia and JaVale McGee to be their centers to replace Andrew Bogut, and they played a ton of minutes on this team. But Draymond was also a small center, and this was the peak of Draymond's powers defensively and offensively, with him being an incredible playmaker while also giving you a Defensive Player of the Year performance throughout that year. Andre Iguodala still had a lot of game left to him. Steph and KD averaged 25 points per game on incredible efficiency, with Clay right behind them at 22 points per game with incredible efficiency. There's no overselling how good this team is. This team is arguably the greatest team of all time. And I think they're my greatest team of all time. Unreal. There was no beating this team. There was no trying and just earning it over this team. This team was unstoppable. They were the most evil team in NBA history. And there's no overselling it. I know I've been a little behind on nostalgia basketball videos, but I have had some stuff this summer, so I will try to amp it up. But this was a lot of fun to make. The Western Conference was evil. The Warriors were evil, and this season was insane. This season can be thrown down to the Western Conference because of OKC and Russ, and the Warriors and the Rockets. And you can add the Cavs in there, but there is no overselling how good this Warriors team was. They dominated all year long. This is Son of a Sports, and I'll catch y'all next time.